Growing up in Poland in the 70s and 80s was extremely different from the Rotten West, as the communist propaganda used to call it. There were basically two types of cars on the road, the small Fiat and the big Fiat. That was it. You had to queue to buy almost anything: toilet paper, food, even a washing machine. Buying the latter could sometimes turn into a 3-day adventure, with family members taking turns in line and informal queue committees forming to keep track of who was next. I remember when my half sister arrived with her newlywed Swedish husband. He simply couldn't understand why everyone in town had suddenly decided to buy a household appliance on exactly the same day. It took him quite a while to grasp what was really going on. Wages were low, but people were incredibly entrepreneurial and resourceful. Nobody had much, and strangely enough, I never remember hearing about anyone being depressed. In fact, I don't think I had even heard that word as a child, but that's a small digression. Despite all the limitations, social life was flourishing. My parents threw parties regularly, and so did their friends. Adults didn't celebrate birthdays much, but name days were a big deal back then. And dinners with friends, even without a particular occasion, were very common. The tables were always full of food, and my dad's pride was to never run out of alcohol. That was not easy because all those uncles, as I called them, could really drink. Most parties had a fairly standard set of dishes, mainly meat-based. Beef tartare with raw egg yolk in the middle, surrounded by chopped pickles and onions, was absolutely non-negotiable. A gathering without it would have been considered incomplete. Then came eggs, two types: hard-boiled eggs with mayonnaise and so-called stuffed eggs. There were always plenty of cold meats: ham, sausages, and the famous Polish kabanosy, thin, dry pork sausages. And there was another classic: vegetable salad, a typical Eastern European mixture of boiled vegetables cut into cubes and mixed with mayonnaise, sour cream, and mustard. If you looked at the food on those party tables and compared it to what was actually available in the shops, you would seriously wonder how it was possible. The answer was simple: not everything came from shops. We bought eggs from a woman who had a small farm in a nearby village. Milk was delivered to our door by a neighbor whose cows grazed on the meadow behind our house. It arrived still warm in a white, slightly chipped enamel milk container. My parents sourced locally whenever they could, including meat. I remember the time of martial law in 1982 when buying animals or meat directly from farmers had technically become illegal. Despite that, my dad and a friend decided to buy a whole pig together. And that wasn't a simple task. First, the animal had to be transported discreetly to an acquaintance who knew how to butcher it, always with the risk of being stopped by the police and having the whole thing confiscated. He would cut the best pieces for ham and turn the rest into sausages. Once that part was done, my dad would bring a trunk full of meat back home and store it in our cellar. The meat was placed in salted water and cured for 7 days before being sent to another friend of the family who smoked it. I will never forget the day my parents brought the finished hams and sausages back home. They were still warm and carried a deep, smoky smell of wood. The aroma filled our entire two-family house and even drew the neighbors out of their apartment. My mom invited them in. Fresh sourdough bread, butter, and slices of perfectly pink ham appeared on the table. Today, that bread would probably be called artisanal. It simply felt like heaven. Since then, I have tasted many different cold meats around the world. Even the finest Parma or Serrano hams have never quite matched the flavor I remembered from that day. But perhaps it wasn't only about the ham. It was the whole experience, the effort it took to get it, the people involved, and the joy of sharing it together. Sometimes the taste of food is inseparable from the story behind it.